Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Friday lunchtime webinar. I'm John Ridd, and as ever, I'm taking the anchor role for today's talk, which is entitled Agile Working, Out of Sight, Out of Mind. And this is going to be presented by Katharine Metters, who I'm sure many of you will know. Katharine is the principal consultant for the WorkRight consultancy division of Posturite. From what I hear, the issues around today's subject are forming an ever-growing part of Katharine's work schedule. And that's perhaps not surprising given the considerable changes we've had in the manner that we work these days with changes in technology. But I don't think that's the only reason. There are other drivers, and we have to be careful that these changes are not putting our workforce at risk, that there are not new risks which we have to cater for, and that's, I think, what Katharine will be addressing. But before we start, I need to point out, I'm sure you're all very well aware these days, but you can put questions to Katharine if you type them in the panel on the right of your screen. And what I'll do at the end of her presentation is try and put as many of these as I can to her. We'll see where we get to. If you don't get your question answered, then these will be answered on the Posturite webinar. They'll be available early next week along with a copy of the presentation. Let me not take up any more of your lunchtime with this introduction. I'll now hand straight over to Katharine for her talk on Agile Working. So, Katharine, over to you.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, Agile Working, out of sight, out of mind. Something that, as John said, I'm getting involved quite a lot, and having been an Agile worker myself for some time now, it's something that I'm actually very positive about. I think just to sort of clarify a little bit to start off with, Agile working can have many different incarnations, I suppose, very many different names. I mean, we come across them with flexible working, novel working, smart working, activity-based working. For me, Agile working is really any work that's not performed at one workstation in one office as a routine. But my talk today is going to be looking more at the more remote aspects of Agile working, where people are working from different offices or maybe from home or from hub areas. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today, although some of the things I'll be discussing will obviously be appropriate for Agile working within one office area where you've got different workstations. So, let's move on, she says. There we go. Agile working. So I think the fact that a lot of clients, a lot of people are going towards it, says that there is a lot of potential. And what I've got on the screen here, I think, is some of the usual drivers on the left, the benefits, and some of the drawbacks I've got on the right-hand side. And I certainly myself find the benefits. I find the flexibility that Agile working gives me, allows me to balance my home and my work. I find not having to travel or travel often in peak times really makes it much more efficient and a much more relaxing way to work. And in fact, actually using remote communication methods, reducing travel, I think is very very worthwhile. It also means that I can communicate more effectively with other people in different countries and different parts of the UK as well. I also quite like the employee increased control. I think there is a real drive that people like to feel a bit more control and direct the way they work, and I think that Agile working really hands over some of the responsibility and the drive to individuals. So I think there are some great benefits, and not least is the one at the bottom there, which I suppose for me should be at the top, is I think it is a great opportunity to get people less sedentary and moving more. However, being a realist and working with people, I am aware that there are some potential pitfalls. I think most of us would agree that longer working hours is definitely something that has been reported. I also think, and I have some pictures of later, people's general postures. And are we actually now getting people working in a series of poor postures rather than anything else? You know, it's fine to be in a poor posture for a short period of time, but if this is a series of postures, we've got a concern. It requires a very much more different way of managing people. And in fact, it is very much sort of coaching people that we need to move to rather than supervising. So I think there are some real changes we need to make. And if we don't get these right, it could really sort of derail what we do. From a very practical point of view, the lone worker issues, having more people out of sight means that we have to address issues of security and health and other issues like that. So I'm really going at this talk with a balance. I want to get the benefits, but I am very aware of the drawbacks. Now, what is going on? Agile working, a new concept, and yet already we have these sorts of headlines. Yahoo orders home workers back into the office. IBM telling remote workers to get back in the office. We think Agile working has this potential, and yet we seem to have some big companies wanting to sort of go the other way. I find this really quite disheartening when I'm so positive about it and find it so useful for myself. And it's not just myself at Posturite. You know, a lot of us here have worked in an agile way for some time and see many benefits. However, we too have realized that it's not universally, doesn't work for everybody. And in fact, we ourselves have had to introduce ways to get people to communicate and actually work collaboratively face to face. So in fact, we've instituted ways to get people back in. And I think that's really what is going on here. These two companies, or certainly IBM and Yahoo, a lot of their work is very self-directed teams, very much a collaborative type culture. And having people sitting remotely in their offices, I think it comes as no surprise when we look at it that perhaps people are struggling. So it's the methods really, and perhaps a little bit of lack of initial thought, that has caused this sort of U-turn, I think. You know, is the reality now the fact that we have communication problems, long hours and fatigue, people feeling isolated, and people maybe working in a series of poor postures? As you see that slide in the middle of the people working on smartphones, this typical head forward posture, which we know and are seeing increasing the number of head and neck problems. You know, of course, we do not want to see that as a regular output of agile working. However, we also need to keep our eye on the positive benefits. As you can see, this is some research done by the Boston Consulting Group, clearly stating that they felt that adopting this agile working makes a company 5 times more likely to be a top performer. Now, it may give them top performing in the short term, but if we don't control those negative outputs, is that continuation going to continue? Their decision on that was, we need to be able to create a different leadership models, so people become coaches and giving people ways to figure things out. For me, it's the information here and the support of the information that's important. My advice, good old-fashioned, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's gain the benefits from agile working, but be very understanding of the potential benefits and work to control them. So it's not the concept of agile working that's the problem, it's our implementation, particularly planning and providing suitable training, and that's training for end users as well as managers. Really, really important. If we provide access to our systems on small devices like iPhones, we really cannot be surprised that people take the opportunities to maybe go home and then work on these small devices. It really shouldn't come as a surprise to us, and yet it is. So why do we get it wrong? Well, the first changes we tend to see where people start working in these more agile ways is a removal of person-specific workstations. I think that's quite good. And what is it replaced by? Well, it's replaced by people given remote mobile devices that they could use in nice, outside environments. But as we could see, the postures there perhaps aren't as we want to see. We do generally see an element of home working, and as we can see from the middle slide, yes, that's great, but again, the postures are a problem. And then we see these more relaxed, soft working areas, and that's great, but so long as they're used for the correct tasks. I went in to do some teaching on a client's site the other day, and they have a lovely atrium area, and it was really bright. It was a lovely area to work, and I walked in and there was a gentleman sat on a nice soft sofa on his laptop doing a bit of surfing, doing a little bit of inputting. I thought, that's great. Unfortunately, when I came back a couple of hours later to grab a cup of tea, he was there in the same place. Now that's obviously not so good. The even worse thing was when I came to leave at the end of my session, which was several hours later, he was still there. This, unfortunately, is not an unusual occurrence, and I think we could all think of the times that we've been in cafes and on transport and seen people working for prolonged periods of time in these very poor postures. So where does the decision go wrong? I think we'd like to think that ourselves and our colleagues are, intelligent people, and that we understand about good posture. We've had the DSE regulations for over 25 years. We've had the same advice about how we should be working. So how is it going wrong? Well, I think the important thing is to remember that as humans, we're generally motivated by short-term gains. And unless there is immediate pain, those short-term gains tend to win over and influence our actions. We pay very little attention to today's risks, not so much to tomorrow's, and very little to anything that may affect us in 10 years' time. So it's really important that we find different ways of getting our decisions across and getting people to make the decisions. Those of you, I'm sure many of you are aware of Hertzberg's work, and this is quite interesting if we have to sort of dig down into how we make decisions and what motivates us and what satisfies us and doesn't satisfy us. And the really interesting thing about Hertzberg's work was to look at, he basically said that actually what provides motivation is actually not the same as what is not the opposite of what causes dissatisfaction. And if you look at the slide there, you can see he grouped into two categories. You've got the factors for motivation and the factors for dissatisfaction. Now, most of us actually want to achieve motivation. And as you can see, that's generated by recognition and achievement and responsibility, very much these coaching type of activities. And this perhaps is where a lot of the manager's training needs to be focused, to be able to get this motivation for staff. Whereas things that will cause us dissatisfaction are on the right-hand side. And these will often be the bread and butter of implementing agile working policies. And I think we have to very much think about these ones to be able to get a good output. We need to look at both, but it's perhaps different peoples at different times who will use these to be able to get a good output. So somebody is satisfied and motivated to look after the business, but also to look after themselves. So how do people make decisions? Well, we really break it down into these 5 areas. So before we decide what a decision we need to make, we need to identify the goal. And hopefully our business goals are well communicated to our staff. But we have to remember that people have their own personal goals too. So yes, they may need to focus on getting a piece of work done, but they actually also have got their own personal goals of getting home to do their childcare, or that short-term comfort of sitting in a nice soft sofa. So we need to make sure that we know what the goals of our people are. Then, to make a decision, we have to gather information. This again is something that we could influence. We need to make sure that employees are aware of all the options they have available to them. Quite often I find that people have put a lot of time and effort into providing information for staff about how they can do agile working, how they can communicate, how they can book rooms and things like that. But actually it's never managed to get through to the employee. So therefore they make decisions based on incomplete information and therefore don't get the best out of the situation. So once we've gathered our information, that's the point at which the human then makes considers their consequences. And that's where what I said earlier about, we are often focused on short-term gain really comes in. So we need to make sure that people have a good balance as to the outcomes of their actions. And once we've gathered all this information and thought about it, that's when we need to make the decision. And that's when the person's decision will be to make a decision to do a piece of work on a small device, which if it's a high inputting device is probably going to be the wrong decision. Or whether they say, well, do you know what, I know I'm going to be traveling, therefore I'm going to perform a very much reading task whilst I travel because that's the best way to do it. So we need to be able to influence that decision by what's gone through before. And then obviously they're going to evaluate the decision. Now, unless they get pain, they are probably not going to, unless they get immediate pain, they're not going to evaluate that perhaps their decision was wrong. Even if they get a bit of neck stiffness, they may go, oh, it's just one of those things. So that again, we need to make sure they're aware of the consequences of their action and encourage them to think clearly about how they worked and whether that was the most appropriate way to do so. So, gathering information, as I said, what can we do? Well, to get them to make the right decision, we need to make sure that they are aware of the attractive spaces we've created for them. Be clear about their work objectives. Quite often I go in and we find the collaborative spaces are actually the place they put all the old spare furniture and it's a bit dark and dingy. Well, it's hardly likely that people are going to choose to work there. We need to make sure that they have good remote connections and good ability to use them too, and that the whole culture is that we look after ourselves and we work rather than work comes always before one's own health. So looking at that, those are places we can influence, that information gathering section. So the common issues that come up for me now that people get on the phone and speak to my colleagues out are these ones here. Who is responsible for how employees work when working in an agile way? That's a very interesting one. Now we want to give the control over to the employee, but we can only do that if we provide them with support and get them to make the right decisions. We're getting a lot of discussions about driver discomfort, so that it may be due to the fact that people are working a lot more in their cars, or maybe nobody ever tells us how we should be setting ourselves up, or even what the functions of our car seat are. Get a lot of questions about specialist equipment. People have been provided specialist equipment in the past. Now does it have to be replicated at every workstation? Well, quite interestingly, if we're designing a hot desking area with lots of flexibility, actually sometimes we accommodate far more of our staff. So perhaps the need for individual adaptations of workstations will go down. There will always be people who need specific requirements, but actually I think we'll find that actually better workstations make sure that we need less individual adaptations. There will always be the home working issues we have to address. And the one that I'm just going to come on to in a very little bit is how long should employees work on portable equipment? This is a question I get asked to advise on quite a lot of the time. I've got a little slide later about that. And also we need to, people have got nice spaces, but people have not thought about acoustics and privacy. So can we work together and still be remote? Well, I very much think we can. If we create environments that encourage people to be active and support their work, then we can encourage people at times to be collaborative, at times to work on their own. If we focus on what the task needs to be achieved and create environments to support that, that'll really improve things. One interesting fact I did find the other day, I have had a lovely article talking about actually different preferences for remote working. And interestingly, people of my age, sort of 50s plus, seem to be more comfortable with it. And yet younger employees prefer to work around other members of staff. That surprised me until I saw the discussion was all about actually being supportive and passing on information, passing on experience. And I think certainly when I was younger, I did like to be able to just pop and talk to people about things. And I think that obviously remains the case today. So we need to build that into what we're thinking about too, and make sure that there are opportunities for younger, less experienced members of staff to have access to the experience of us older, wiser, apparently, people. So on the screen now are a few specifics. I think, again, I'm saying attractive collaborative areas with privacy and good acoustics is a real draw to people making the right decision. We need to change the way we train our managers, more to be coaches to get people to access information and make good decisions. We need to make sure the training is available for different abilities. I need a lot more coaching before I'm able to use a new IT system than somebody else. Let's make sure we empower everybody. We need to make sure that communication methods are simple and easy to use, that reference material is nicely produced and, again, accessible, not hidden away on the internet somewhere that people can't find it. And we need good feedback systems to make sure, as these things evolve, which they will do, that we're able to identify concerns or opportunities and act to them. I mentioned about the car advice and the feedback loops, and I really think that wellness initiatives have a really important point to play here for our physical and mental health. So coming back to my core of being less sedentary and agile working, supporting it. This is some work done by Alan Hedge from Cornell, who is suggesting that a healthy, active work should be something like 20 minutes sitting, 8 minutes standing, and 2 minutes walking. Well, I really think with agile working, I mean, looking at a day I had this week, I started off at home doing some emails, working a bit of report. I then walked to the station, got on the train, went and did some work, did some collaborative work, walked back, got the train, and then did some. So plenty of moving between different ways of working. And really, in the day, not only did my step count look very healthy, but also I felt really quite empowered myself. It really opens up opportunities for us. And when we come down to specifics, as I said earlier, I get a lot of people asking me for some specific advice for different types of working. It's very difficult to be general because different tasks and different situations. But this is what I really came up with. But my overriding message that I want to get to people is the worse your position, the more movement is required. And as I think you can see from this slide, you start off with the more traditional office seated, good work setup, and then we go all the way through to the small device work. And actually, as you go from the good setup to the less suitable setup, we need more activity and more focus on movement. So I really just want to finish to say I still believe that agile working is a real catalyst for change and getting more movement, and we can really get some benefits out of it. But we do need to make sure we give plenty of thought to the planning and the information we provide to people. And we need to remember how people make choices when we build our systems and our environments. Because if we don't influence the decisions they make, we're not going to get the outcomes that we have. So preferably not out of sight, out of mind, but out of sight, making good decisions, I think. And on that, John, back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Katharine. Yet again, a lot of good advice in there, and I particularly like take your point about the short-term gains in the sense of people not really taking account of the long-term risk when they do some of these or take up these agile working postures and so forth. Sort of makes me think of the problem that we've all very well aware of with smoking, that short-term gain, if you like, a bit of relaxation and so forth, we're not really taking account of the long-term risks. And I think this is the problem, certainly with musculoskeletal problems, that these issues may well bring forward in the future. But hopefully the variety that you're promoting will mean that people at least don't sit for too long in these poor postures. Now, there are questions coming in, I believe, but if I can, may I start with something I perhaps, and perhaps this is just me, but I had a little bit of problem with your use of terms in the presentation, in that you were talking about training people and coaching people, and I wasn't particularly aware of what you were meaning by that might be the difference between these two techniques. And do you have something that you can clarify for at least for me in that respect?
Yes, I mean, I always think that training tends to be a more formal program, as it were, whereas coaching is often done more one-to-one. So it's your manager talking to you perhaps about the way of working, your decision-making process, and helping you to make better decisions, whereas training tends to be a little bit more formal, providing you with information and explaining the potential output. Does that make a bit more sense to you?
Well, yes, it does. I can see that is the way that we need to go with this, is bringing people with us, if you like, and the coaching has that greater potential for being successful in that, I think.
I'm definitely getting a feeling that people are more wanting to make their own decisions rather than being told what to do, and I think sometimes people see training as a little bit of telling rather than enabling them to make decisions. Maybe that's my take on it, but I mean, certainly for myself, I think I, being a little bit of a rebel sometimes, I prefer to think I've made my own decision rather than followed somebody's training, as it were.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly the right way to go, and it's the message, or it's the technique that I think we've realised has been successful in the past with a whole range of different problems that we face. Something else that I was particularly not worried about, but I sometimes wonder whether or not, yes, we get people to make or we're trying to get people to make their own decisions and so forth, but sometimes what we may need to do is to actually ask the workers what they want out of agile working. I mean, you're an agile worker, you whole time, every day. What would you like from your employer that would make your agile working arrangements more comfortable, more workable, if you like? And perhaps that's a dangerous one to ask on an open line where your employer may well be listening.
I think for me, yes. I mean, again, it comes down to, as you said, being asked and sort of said. So, Katharine, instead of you do your tasks, how would you like to do them better? Could you see a way that you could, how could you share information better? Yes, I think you're right. I would like people to say, this is your task. How would you like to achieve it? And how can we as a company enable you to do that? So very much that crossing of information. The people who do the work generally, as you and I know what the problems are and have some really good ideas about what the solutions they wish to be. They're not always 100% right, but they're usually really good in the right direction, I think.
Well, certainly would agree with that. And I mean, I would hope that is a philosophy, a principle, an approach that companies will adopt. And my concern perhaps is that I foresee this as being seen as something which is going to be terribly time-consuming and may end up perhaps not being used or approached in the best possible way. But it is certainly something that I think we should be looking at to do.
Although I think if we create flexible spaces that do many different things, actually you perhaps getting the conversations absolutely 100% right the first time may not be necessary, because if you give people spaces that they private spaces, collaborative spaces, remote conferencing, you may find it will evolve actually. And I think so as long as you create a flexible space and you're prepared for feedback, it perhaps won't take as much time as perhaps anticipated. The only problem then is, how many spaces, what are the actual numbers behind it, I suppose, it get difficult at that point.
Yeah, well, every individual company will have to look at what they can reasonably provide. And I just want to go back as well to something you were saying earlier about the way that younger workers like to work in an environment where they can have contact with other people, sometimes with older people with the experience. And I certainly would agree with that. But I think we also need to be aware that for the older workers who one might apparently believe they're happy to work on their own, I think there then is a risk that those people become a bit stuck in their ways and they're not presented with the new ideas and the new techniques that the young Turks or whoever come into the business and have. And that would indeed be a concern of mine with companies which totally go over to agile working, which doesn't, not forcefully, but doesn't have a reason to bring people back together fairly routinely and regularly.
I mean, I would agree with you. Actually, I was quite surprised to find that research, because that wasn't what I was expecting. But actually, when I sort of read into it, it made a bit of sense. But I think if we do it properly, I said properly, but if people say, well, actually, we want to have the experience going down to our less experienced workers, then hopefully that there will be a reciprocal benefit to those who are providing the experience by providing ways of discussion, I think. So I think I agree with you, we don't want to isolate people, but I'm hopeful that actually it's a two-way street.
Yeah, no, I think we probably all need to keep that perspective, and hopefully that's a good way forward, and probably a good way to close this, although I've just had a couple more questions come in if we have got a couple of minutes. Yeah, could you tell us the reference for that research? Someone asking on.
I haven't got it in front of me, but I can get it and I will put it on the FAQs.
Okay.
That was for the older worker, younger worker. Yes, I will find it and post it.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've used up our time for this lunchtime one. So if I can thank Katharine again for her presentation. Certainly, as ever, thank you all for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did miss any of it and want to come back to it, then it will, as Katharine says, be on the system next week, I believe. We're now taking a short break, well, a summer break from the webinar program, and I hope, looking out of my window, I hope you find some better summer weather over the next few months than appears at the moment. But thanks again for listening, and hope to see you again in the autumn.